I want to thank all of you for being here today. It's a real privilege to speak to any group in Tahlequah. This has been a sad week and a happy week. We've been here for a little over a month, but tomorrow we're departing Tahlequah, and it sort of grows on you after 32, 34 days, and it does feel like home. But I did grow up in Oklahoma, across the mountains in the Choctaw Nation, a little town called Red Oak. If you blink your eyes, you'll miss it. But anyway, I'm a true Oklahoman, but I've been gone for 60 years. But I still enjoy coming back, and we do come back every year or two to check Judge John Martin's gravesite over at Fort Gibson. I really get on to Dr. Blackburn if his people doesn't keep it clean and mowed, because I'm a fanatic about that. And we're working with the park manager who does a super job, and David Fowler has promised me he will continue to take care of Judge John's gravesite, and I'm sure he will. Judge John Martin was the first Cherokee justice of the Cherokee Nation, and he was born October the 20th, 1784, in a small Cherokee community on the confluence of the Little Tennessee and the Big Tennessee rivers, a place called Coyote. In some of the letters that John Sr.'s brother, General Joseph Martin, wrote, and I have copies of, he spelled it Cowatie, but it's Coyote, and it's no longer there. The two rivers are still there, but the little community is not. It was located about 38 miles southwest of Knoxville, and he died at Fort Gibson on October the 17th, 1840. His parents were John Martin Sr. and Susanna Emery. Susanna was an 8th Cherokee, and she was a granddaughter of Ludovic Grant, which many of you know. Ludovic Grant came to the America about 1716 after the Jacobite Wars in Europe. He went to South Carolina, became a trader, worked for the governor, and eventually established and married a full-blood Cherokee woman in Tellico, over around the old sacred city of Chota. There are still some confusion, in the Martin families at least, about who Judge John Martin's father was. I have proved, and many other people have proved beyond a doubt, that the father was John Martin Sr. We have documents from the Georgia archives. I have a document from the governor of Georgia. We've also done some DNA testing, and I don't know a lot about DNA testing, but I'm pretty involved in the DNA testing. We're still using that, trying to find relatives today. But his father was John Martin Sr., a brother to General Joseph Martin, Major Bryce Martin, Captain William Martin, and another brother by the name of George. George remained on the farm in Charlottesville, Virginia, I'm sorry. And the rest of the boys went to the Cherokee Nation as long hunters, and some of them had fur trading posts. And John Sr. had a fur trading post. While the Cherokee agent, General Joseph Martin, was the agent at Long Island, he married Betsy Ward, the daughter of Nancy Ward, whom all of you, I'm sure you know. It was at this time, we believe, that John Martin Sr. met Susanna Emery. They stayed at Long Island for approximately 1 year because of some uprisings around the Chota area. they were whisked up to the island, 16 people. I have a letter that General Joseph wrote the governor of North Carolina wanting to know how he's going to be paid for keeping these 16 people, and one of them was his brother. And I don't know if he was ever paid or not. It's believed that Susanna died about 1790, and Judge John's father died about 1795. We have searched extensively for this information, and it's just not out there. Someday I want to go to the Georgia area and do some more research and see if we can find their final resting place. Judge John entered the Cherokee politics about 1818. I found a document the other day that said 1817, but we know he got very involved. He was living in the middle of the Cherokee Nation in the Habersham, Lupkin County at the time, where one of his sisters lived, and his parents had died. So he became very involved in the Cherokee Nation and became the first Chief Justice of the Cherokee Nation, 1823 up to 1828. He was also the circuit judge for 2 Cherokee districts, the Amaho and the Kosawati districts from 1822 to 1828. Now, you realize as a circuit judge, he probably got on his horse every day and had to ride 20, 30, 40 miles because these 2 places were not close to each other. They were some miles apart. He was also the delegate and signer of the first Cherokee Constitution, and on July the 26th, 1827. And I believe there was about 4 people that signed that Constitution. He was also the first treasurer of the Cherokee Nation in 1827. He was responsible for the Cherokee Ferry on the Chattahoochee River called Van's Ferry. He would lease that out. At one time, I think he might have actually had the lease himself, but he was basically responsible for that ferry. He was also one of the commissioners that laid out the town and 100 lots in New Echota, where the first printing press was located. I don't know if it's this printing press or not, but that's where they printed the first newspaper. And he helped lay out this new town. This was when the Cherokees were pushed over into Georgia. They established their headquarters at New Echota. He was elected the Chief Justice of the Cherokee Supreme Court, as I mentioned, under the 1839 Constitution after the Trail of Tears. To me, that tells me a lot about Judge John Martin because of this. As most of you know, there was 2 factions, the Treaty Party and the John Ross Party. And they were really at each other's throats for several years. Judge John was able to bridge that gap and still be elected as the first Supreme Court Justice here in Tahlequah. Now that tells me that he must have been quite an individual to bridge that gap, because we all know what happened later. Judge John was a Georgia farmer and had 2 large farms, one on the Kosawati River and one in the Salacoa Valley. They're both basically the same areas, but 2 large farms. He had 2 large farms and 2 large, beautiful homes for his 2 wives. Each of his wives had 8 children, and they were sisters. Now, some of you ladies probably think of that and shake your head, but you have to remember, women in those times had a very, very rough time. And if they would accept another husband, that was okay. And many people, especially the people that were out in the Cherokee Nation, I'm talking about white men that were in the Cherokee Nation, it was quite acceptable to have 2 wives. they called those people countrymen. And that simply meant he was probably married to a Cherokee woman and had children by her. And many times when you read some of the history, it will refer to John Martin Sr. as Countryman John. This is one of the ways that we identified him as being the father of Judge John Martin through research. Many of Judge John's descendants, and some of you here today, Margaret, I don't know who else is a Judge John descendant here today, but Margaret, he had many descendants that were prominent in the Cherokee Nation. I'd like to mention just a few of them because most people don't realize this or don't know this. William Penn Adair, who was the assistant Cherokee chief in 1879. He was elected for a 4-year term, but he died after 1 year in office. He died in October 1890. Jesse Milam, M-I-L-A-M, was the principal chief from 1841 to 1849. If you go through the Cherokee Heritage Center, you will see a lot of inscriptions on the walls about this gentleman. He did a lot for the Cherokee Nation, one of Judge John's descendants. There was also Captain Joseph Lynch Martin. He owned the property around the Cabin Creek battle sites. He actually owned or controlled 110,000 acres. I know that he leased much of that from the Cherokee Nation, but that's where the battle was fought principally. There was also John Walter Martin, who was a very successful merchant up in Veneta. He owned a large saddle shop. Today we don't see saddle shops, but he owned a large saddle shop back in those days, very successful. There was also Joseph Martin LaHaye, who was an attorney and judge for the Cherokee Nation, elected 1899. I believe, Margaret, that's your ancestor, right?
My great-great-grandfather.
Yeah. There was Bryce Martin Adair, elected Cherokee Nation Council in 1841. Roland Kirk Adair, superintendent of the male seminary, 1895 to 1899. And Joseph Martin Lynch, Jr., was a Cherokee Nation justice. Cicero Lynch was the Flint District Sheriff and Cherokee Nation Circuit Judge. And then last that I've got written down was Philip Viles, was the Chief Supreme Court Justice, Cherokee Nation, and he helped us unveil the monument that we installed about 2 weeks ago on Saturday, June the 8th. And Judge Martin's daughters married a number of prominent Cherokee families, such as the Vans, Adair, Thompson, McCoy, Bell, Lynch, and other women that I haven't mentioned, or other names that I haven't mentioned. After Georgia passed the 1831 Cherokee Removal Act, John moved to Bradley County, which was not far away. We think he moved into this home about 1833, 1834. The records do not say. But we believe that both his wives and all 16 children lived in this home for a period of maybe 3 or 4 years. This was just down the road from Chief John Ross's farm. Most of the Cherokee leadership lived in that same area. And Chief John Ross's farm, as I mentioned, was very close by this home. And today the home is being lived in by a family, and it's open to the public. He left his home, and it's about 8 miles southeast of Cleveland, Tennessee. And he left there in March of 1837, headed for the Cherokee Nation with 300 other families. We think it took about 3 months for them to make the journey. Also, just recently I discovered that Stan Wadey was in that party of 300. And I did not know that until just the past week. You know, Stan Wadey later became a Cherokee general and the only Confederate general during the Civil War, and also the last general of the Civil War to surrender or to lay down his arms. Judge John's home in Tennessee has recently been added to the National Historic Home Register and also placed on the Trail of Tears location. And as I said, it's right near John Ross's farm. After arriving in Indian Territory in 1837, Judge John continued to work for the common Cherokee people and helped write the new Constitution of 1839 after the Trail of Tears, and was again elected the first Chief Justice of the Cherokee Nation, which I've alluded to previously. Shortly after being elected the second time, Judge John Martin died on October the 17th, 1840, while conducting business at Fort Gibson. He was buried and a crypt placed over his gravesite, and I believe it's at Jackson and Elm Street. You all know what a crypt is. I was over there a few years ago, and one of the guys sort of whispered in my ear and said, "Joe, he's not there." And at the time, I didn't really know what he was talking about, but Linda and I went up to the gravesite a little later and discovered that the lid was slid over slightly. So the guy had evidently looked inside and didn't see any bones, so he assumed that he was not there. What he didn't realize that it was common practice, not common practice, but at least a practice to bury some prominent people, military and civilians, in a crypt. They would bury them 6 feet and then put a crypt over the gravesite. And I have since told his boss that of the practice that was done back in those days. About 4 or 5 years ago, a cabin was moved to the gravesite, and we're very concerned about this cabin. It's an old dog trot cabin. All of you know what a dog trot cabin is. It's 2 ends of home with a walkway or a breezeway between it, and the dogs would run back and forth. I guess they called it a dog trot. This could be one of only 2 or 3 dog trot cabins left in the whole state. They do have another one at Fort Gibson that's in good condition, but this one hardly receives any money whatsoever. But we're hoping, and we've had a meeting with them, and we're hoping they will refurbish this cabin and use it as a educational and a presentation site. It would be terrible if they don't do something to this cabin and then it eventually falls to the ground. Sort of lost my place here. On June the 8th, we had 200 plus relatives of Judge John attend the monument dedication. And that evening we sponsored a dinner and had about 200 at the dinner from 18 states. And we had relatives there from about 5 different Martin families, including 2 or 3 of Judge John's uncles' families. It was a great turnout. The dedication was supported by the Cherokee Nation, and all of the Cherokee Nation's leadership was involved. And I want to thank the Cherokee Nation and Chief Baker for getting behind this. Now, we raised the money, we bought the monument, but that was the game plan up front. I told him that we will pay for everything. We didn't ask the Cherokee Nation for 1 dime. Not that they wouldn't have helped, but we just didn't ask, and we didn't have to do that. Also, while we've been in town, Linda and I visited the Thompson House, which is located down on 300 College Street.
South College.
And we've discovered that that home belonged and was built by a descendant of Judge John's sister, Nancy, who was the Thompson family. So that was a great find for us because we didn't know that before. I might also mention that since we've been here, we have found 2 other descendants of his other sister, Rachel. So they go from North Carolina, Georgia, all the way to Oklahoma. We had people here from California to Virginia, South Dakota, North Carolina, and everything in between. So I might mention on the Thompson House, it's open to the public, but you need to make an appointment, and the phone numbers are on the handicap doorway, so it's pretty easy to find it. And I recommend all of you to go to this home. It's a beautiful home. It's a post-revolutionary or a post-Civil War home. It's not an antebellum home, but it's very closely designed as such. I want to thank Travis Owens and the Cherokee Tourism Office who invited me to speak today. I forgot to mention, and I should have, but this is something, we had this made up, the descendants of Judge John Martin. We had this made. I had it made in Phoenix recently because there was nothing in the Supreme Court Museum that would indicate anything about Judge John Martin. And so we had this made up, and it lists all of his titles. In fact, his titles were so many that there was a group of Cherokees that complained about it. They thought he had too much power. And then also, the governor, she wrote a letter, which I thought was pretty nice, and hopefully they'll put that up somewhere. And she and her staff contacted me at least 6 or 8 times, and she was going to be here. When I say here, the 8th of June, but just couldn't make it. But anyway, take a look at these 2 things, and they will eventually be placed somewhere.
Absolutely.
I don't know where, but somewhere. And with that, again, I want to thank you very much for coming.